Hi everyone, welcome to Sharpen Up on JavaScript. Today we're going to look at const and let. Const and let allow us to represent and reuse values in our code, like we can with var, but with some added benefits. Var is the traditional way that we declare variables in JavaScript, but compared to other programming languages, var has some quirks and shortcomings that can lead to unintended bugs and difficult to read code. Const and let have been introduced to address those issues with var by giving us finer control over a variable's lifecycle by using block scope, the ability to distinguish and enforce read-only status on a value to mark it as constant as opposed to being a variable. Let's start with exploring how var handles scope to get a better understanding of how let and const differ. JavaScript variables declared with the var keyword use function scope. All vars are local to the closest function they are declared within. Let's look at an example of that. So if you define a function, and we'll just put some kind of a if statement here, define a var of function scope value equals thing, and then we'll log that out. And if we go ahead and call that, we should expect the output to log thing, even though we defined and declared the variable inside of an if statement. This is kind of different to how other languages do handle this situation. Another quirk of function scope is that all variable declarations inside a function are treated as if they are declared at the top of a function. This is called hoisting. A variable that's been used before being declared inside the same function block is valid and doesn't throw a JavaScript error because hoisting treats the variable as if it was declared at the top of the function. So we'll take a look at that as well. So we get our function of scope function and we do a for loop, and then we will define a value without declaring it, and then log that out. After the outside of the for loop, we'll declare it using var, and then we'll call it. And you'll see, no problems at all, even though we used a variable before it was declared. Because of hoisting it worked, because it's essentially taking this declaration and putting it right there. Logically it's doing that, hoisting the value up to the top. So what is the alternative? Well, the alternative that const and let use is block scope. Block scope means that the life cycle of a variable is confined to the closest enclosing code block instead of the closest function. Examples of blocks are loops, like for loops, while loops, do while loops, conditional statements such as if else, or switch statements, functions, and even arbitrary blocks. Let's take a look at some examples. If we were to create a conditional block, such as an if block, and then define a variable using let inside a block, that would currently be in scope inside this block here. And we'll also do the same thing for a for loop. We declare a loop variable in here, and an arbitrary block, and also a function. And all that's valid, of course. But if we were to take if thing and try and console.log it out, outside of the block, you get a JavaScript error. Same thing applies for loop thing, block thing, and same thing applies for function thing. If it's out of scope, it's going to throw a JavaScript error. Block scope cascades down into nested blocks. So you don't lose scope of a variable if execution flows down into an inner block. A block scope variable declared in an inner block will be out of scope in the outer block. So you can think of block scope cascading down, but not bubbling up. Copy that loop there, make an inner loop. We'll define some variables. We'll make a constant and a let to show you that these work in for both const and let, which are block scope variables. Outer equals outer, constant, and let inner equals inner, and other inner. Log out this value here of other inner. We get it within the loop, and it's been executed 25 times because it's in the inside here. If we were to try and log this value out in the outer loop, where it isn't defined, we'd run into some trouble. Same goes for a let, doesn't work. But because block scope variables can cascade down, you can take outer or other outer, log them there, and there aren't any errors. So const and let do away with the variable hoisting and function scoping model in favour of block scoping. Block scoping is more conventional when you consider the majority of programming languages take this approach to variable scope. Block scoping without hoisting makes representing values in code less prone to logic errors by enforcing that a variable or constant is always declared before it is used and must be declared where it is used, improving clarity. keeping scope of the variable or constant as small as possible. As we've just seen, both const and let are block scoped as opposed to the function scope var, but const and let are not identical and each has their own distinct purpose. Let values can be defined, redefined, or declared and left undefined. Const values can only be defined once and must be defined as soon as they're declared. Let should be used in any place where a value is expected to change. For example, in a for loop that changes value on each iteration. Conversely, use const when you expect a value to remain the same through the life cycle of an application. Let's take a quick look at a combination of const and let examples. Let's start by declaring a let variable of now. And what this is going to do is output a timestamp for the current date. Now equals new date. Note how I declared it without a definition and now I'm defining it. We would like to do that with a let. There's a timestamp. Then if we just find some constants, so we'll do direction up in big capital letters, const direction down. So we have a set of constants and a set of variables using let. So we try and redefine now to the current new date and time to a console.log. We can redefine it no problem at all. But if we try and redefine direction up to 4, we get a JavaScript error. This is very helpful. The JavaScript parser is kind of got our back and is looking out for us, so that's great. So that pretty much covers all that needs to be said about let, but there are some gotchas to be aware of when using const. So let's look at const in more detail now. The const keyword is a useful addition to JavaScript, but it's not without its caveats. Using const ensures that a value cannot be reassigned once it is declared, and that it must be assigned immediately at the time of declaration. This is true for primitive values, numbers, strings, booleans, but for more complex values such as arrays and objects, the behavior differs. Arrays and objects are effectively containers for other values, and const only prevents the reference to the containers from being reassigned. It does not make the contents immutable. Immutable meaning that a value cannot change. Primitive constants are completely immutable. The contents of const arrays and objects are mutable. This means that object properties can be added, changed, and removed. And here's an example of that. So if we define a const person and give them the name Mike, age 30. So we'd find a constant for a person and we're going to change some of the values in that object. So person.name equals Bob. It's constant. And intuitively you would think that you wouldn't be able to do this. However, if we do a refresh on the browser, no JavaScript errors. Add a new property. We'll also delete a property as well. So delete the name, we still have 0 errors. However, if we try and reassign the reference of person, so person equals blank object, and give that a refresh, we have a JavaScript error. Arrays behave the same as objects with regards to how a const value is treated. Here's another handy dandy example. We can push items into this array. We can remove the first item, and we can even redefine values in there. So if you go to index 2 and change that to changed, then log that out, much like an object, we're able to do that. Absolutely fine. However, if we were to try and reassign things to a new array, we're going to run into some problems. And also, if we were to take the existing array and spread it and add a new item, still got errors. Can't do that. The reference of the const is being protected, but the values inside are not. If you're trying to make an object or an array immutable, take a look at object.freeze. It's a built-in JavaScript function that makes the contents of an object or array immutable. Object.freeze might better suit your needs and can be used in conjunction with defining a value as const. So I brought back our person example here. And if we just do an object.freeze on person and then try and reassign the name to John and then log it out, you're going to see some interesting behavior. No JavaScript error. But do you notice how the name is still Mike? So that's something that's a little bit quirky about object.freeze, but it might better suit your purposes compared to using const. But you can, of course, use them in conjunction with each other. So I know what you're probably thinking. Where does this leave us with var? Well, I use the following rule of thumb guidelines to help decide which keyword to use. Use const by default. Unless you know the value you're declaring needs to change throughout your program. Use let if the value you're defining needs to change as part of the behavior. You don't need to use var anymore. Use const or let instead. But what about legacy code? In the real world, most legacy applications will use var exclusively in the source code. It's really up to you whether or not to change the old code to use const and let. My advice is to add const and let to new pieces of functionality by default, provided that the legacy codebase doesn't disallow the use of const and let for backwards compatibility with older browsers. There's good news and bad news when it comes to browser support. The good news is that all current versions of the most popular browsers, Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and Safari, support const and let. So if your target audience uses an up-to-date browser, then you're good to go and start using const and let instead of var. The bad news is that const and let cannot be polyfilled into older browsers, and running code in those older browsers will cause JavaScript errors. To mitigate this, you could add a language transpiler such as Babel to your build process. If you don't use a build process but need that backwards compatibility, then you will need to develop one to use a transpiler. Babel allows you to configure the target version of JavaScript or target specific legacy browsers. The transpiler then generates backwards compatible code. The best choice is to just use const and let natively unless you need to support older browsers. In conclusion, const and let are useful additions to JavaScript. They allow for tighter control over assignment and scope of values in your code, and they are a drop-in replacement for var. So what are you waiting for? Start using const and let today. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. And remember, stay sharp.